There is a moment in a woman's life when something quietly shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically. It happens the way dawn happens. Not all at once, but in gradual degrees of light, until suddenly the room is completely different and you wonder how you ever mistook the dark for normal. She looks at her own life, maybe over a cup of coffee that has gone cold, maybe in the silence after a fight that didn't need to happen, and something inside her stops apologizing for noticing the truth. She realizes, with the kind of clarity that cannot be unfelt, that she has been accepting far less than she deserves, and that realization, quiet as it is, sends tremors through everything around her. It unsettles the man who assumed she would always adjust. It confuses the friends who built their own compromises on the assumption that everyone compromises. It shakes the family narrative that told her accommodation was love. Today, we are going to explore what it actually means when a woman consciously chooses solitude over a relationship that diminishes her, what it reveals about her inner architecture, her psychological evolution, and the deeper currents of transformation that Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to map. Stay with me through the end of this, because what we are going to uncover is not just about relationships. It is about the most fundamental act of psychological integration a human being can undertake. Inside the collective unconscious, there lives an old assumption, ancient and deeply embedded, that a woman will ultimately bend, that she will adapt, accommodate, and find a way to make peace with less. This belief is not personal. It was never personal. It is a cultural inheritance passed down through generations of relational conditioning, reinforced by 1,000 small moments in which a woman learned that her own needs were somehow negotiable. Jung understood this dynamic through the lens of what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, as distinct from who the world has needed you to be. Most people never fully begin this process. They live their lives shaped by what Jung called the persona, the mask constructed for social survival, the version of the self that keeps the peace, earns approval, and quietly swallows what doesn't fit. But there comes a point, often in midlife, often in the aftermath of a relationship that has cost too much, when a woman begins to hear something underneath the mask, her own voice, and it is asking questions she can no longer ignore. The woman who chooses solitude over a toxic dynamic has encountered what Jung described as the shadow, not her shadow in the sense of her own darkness, but the shadow material that gets projected onto her within a relationship that does not see her clearly. She has lived inside someone else's projection long enough to recognize the shape of it. She has felt herself shrinking to fit a frame that was never built for her actual dimensions. There is a very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from this. It is not the tiredness of overwork. It is the tiredness of self-erasure.
Imagine spending years translating yourself into a language the other person is only willing to half hear. Imagine editing your reactions, softening your boundaries, finding excuses for behavior that would have been unacceptable to the woman you were before. This is what chronic relational stress does. It does not arrive like a storm. It arrives like weather you stop noticing because it has simply become the climate of your life. The first dimension this choice reveals is her relationship to emotional noise. She has learned to distinguish between tension that is generative and tension that is corrosive, conflict that leads somewhere and conflict that only circles. What the French Romantic tradition once coded as passion, those volatile oscillations between closeness and chaos, she now recognizes as dysregulation. The jealousy that was once romanticized as proof of love, she sees it now as a bid for control dressed in the language of feeling. The subtle dismissals, the microaggressions disguised as jokes, the way her intuition was consistently framed as oversensitivity, none of these were love. They were the architecture of a dynamic that needed her diminished in order to function. Choosing solitude is not a rejection of love, it is a refusal to confuse love with chaos. This is a distinction that sounds simple, but requires extraordinary courage to live by, because culture has spent a very long time convincing women that intensity and love are the same thing. If this is resonating with you, if something in this exploration is touching a place in your own story that you have been trying to articulate for a long time, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We go deep here. We do not do surface. Every video is an attempt to give language to the things that are hardest to say, and I do not want you to miss what comes next. The second revelation is about time, and this one tends to land with a particular weight for women in their late 30s and beyond. There is a scene many women recognize. You are lying awake at 2 in the morning, not because you cannot sleep, but because some part of you is running a quiet audit. You are counting the years, not with bitterness, but with the sober precision of someone who has finally decided to tell herself the truth. How many professional projects were indefinitely postponed to manage someone else's emotional volatility? How many creative ambitions were quietly starved because there was no energy left after the daily work of keeping the peace? How many friendships drifted into silence because a relationship was consuming everything, like a fire that burns the whole house to stay warm? Jung described the second half of life as the period in which the soul begins demanding its real agenda. This is not a metaphor.
Psychologically, something genuinely shifts in midlife. The strategies that worked for the first half, approval-seeking, adaptive self-concealment, relational self-sacrifice, begin to feel not just uncomfortable, but actively destructive. The psyche will not keep funding a dynamic that is costing more than it returns. A woman who chooses solitude has understood this not as a concept, but as a lived reality. Every month inside a relationship that is draining her is not just a month of stagnation, it is a month of active regression, a month in which the distance between herself and her own potential grows wider. This is not cruelty. This is accounting. The third dimension this choice illuminates is psychological health, and it is perhaps the most difficult to describe to someone who has not yet named it in their own experience. Anxiety becomes ambient when you live in a relational environment that is consistently unpredictable. Not the acute anxiety of a crisis, but the background hum of a nervous system that has learned it cannot fully relax. A woman in this dynamic often does not realize how accustomed she has become to that hum until it stops, until she is alone, genuinely alone, and notices with something close to shock that her shoulders have dropped 2 inches, that she can finish a thought without bracing for interruption, that she slept through the night without a single dream she had to explain. Jung wrote about the importance of what he called psychological space, the interior room in which the self can observe itself clearly. Toxic relational dynamics collapse that space. They fill it with noise, demand, defensive reasoning, and the perpetual labor of managing another person's projected anxieties. What isolation from this noise makes possible is not simply rest, it is clarity. A woman choosing solitude is not choosing emptiness. She is choosing the silence in which her own signal can finally be heard. The difference between those two things is the entire distance between shrinking and becoming. Here is the emotional peak of everything we are exploring, the fourth dimension. What happens to a woman's internal compass when disrespect has been administered in small enough doses to feel normal? There is a psychological mechanism, well documented and devastatingly effective, in which the mind recalibrates its sense of acceptable in response to consistent exposure. The behavior she would have walked away from in the first month of knowing someone becomes, 18 months later, something she is explaining to her best friend as complicated or as just how he is. This is not weakness. This is the human mind doing exactly what it was designed to do, adapt. The problem is that this adaptation, when applied to relational dynamics, can quietly dismantle a woman's entire reference system for what she deserves. She accepts less, then she expects less. Then she begins to believe that what she is experiencing is simply what love looks like. Jung called this the gradual surrender to the complex, the psychological moment in which a pattern becomes so dominant that it begins to organize the entire personality around itself. A woman who chooses solitude is choosing something radical in this context. She is choosing to stop the recalibration. She is stepping out of the environment that has been gradually redefining her standards, and she is giving herself the stillness needed to remember what she actually knows. This is not a retreat, this is a reclamation, her own reflection finally undistorted.
The fifth revelation is perhaps the most quietly powerful of all. It is about what becomes possible when you stop filling available space with what is merely available. There is a particular quality of hope that lives in a woman who has chosen to wait for what is real, over settling for what is present. This is not naive optimism. It is not wishful thinking dressed up in psychology. It is a sophisticated understanding of how energy and attention work, rooted in the same Jungian principle that governs all deep transformation. The unconscious moves toward what we genuinely value, not simply what we say we value. When a woman remains in a relationship that does not align with her deepest self, she sends a consistent internal signal that misalignment is her normal. She attracts more of what she tolerates, not because the universe is punishing her, but because her emotional field is organized around a set of expectations she has stopped questioning. Choosing solitude changes the signal. It is an act of energetic clarity, a declaration, made not to anyone else but to her own unconscious, about what she is and is not willing to organize her life around. Jung described this as a realignment with the self, with the deepest layer of the psyche that carries a person's authentic values, not the values they were given, but the ones they discover when the noise finally stops. This solitude is not empty, it is fertile, it is the fallow field before the real harvest. The social pressure that surrounds this kind of choice is real, and it is relentless. It comes from well-meaning places, and it arrives in familiar voices. The mother who worries, the friend who reminds her of her age, the cultural narrative that assigns a woman's value to her relational status and then subtly suggests she is running out of time to secure it. These voices are not malicious, they are afraid. They are the voices of people who made their own accommodations and need to believe that accommodation was the only option. A conscious woman learns to receive this concern with grace while holding her own ground, not defensively, but with the quiet authority of someone who has done the interior work and no longer needs external validation to confirm what she knows. Jung called this psychological maturity, the capacity to differentiate between your own truth and the anxiety projections of others. There is something particular worth noting about how this choice lands on the men in a woman's life. When a woman makes this decision consciously, when she says with clarity and without hostility that she would rather be alone than accept less than she deserves, it can function as a kind of mirror for the men around her. Not a weapon, a mirror. What it reflects is often uncomfortable. It surfaces the places where a man has been investing minimally and expecting fully, where he has been emotionally present enough to hold the relationship but not enough to actually nourish it, where he has mistaken not leaving for loving. Some men, confronted with this mirror, respond with anger. This anger is usually a secondary emotion covering something more vulnerable, the recognition that he has been complicit in something he would not be proud of if he examined it directly. Others become fixated, unable to reconcile the fact that she might genuinely prefer solitude to his presence. This fixation reveals how much his sense of self-worth was organized around his capacity to retain her attention. The men who respond with genuine reflection, who allow the discomfort to become a catalyst, are often changed by it in ways that serve them for the rest of their lives. This is not a story about women versus men. It is a story about two people who were both, in different ways, avoiding the same thing, their own depth, The process of healing that unfolds within chosen solitude does not follow a clean linear path. It tends to move in spirals, revisiting old material from new elevations. The first phase is often decompression. A woman surfaces from the chronic stress of a dysregulated relationship and discovers, sometimes with confusion, how much she was carrying. The silence feels strange before it feels good. What follows is usually a period of rediscovery. She returns to the things she used to love before the relationship consumed the bandwidth for them. A creative practice she abandoned, a friendship she let thin, a way of moving through the world that felt like herself before she started editing herself for someone else's comfort. This phase tends to be accompanied by a particular quality of aliveness that she may not have felt in years. It is not happiness exactly. It is something deeper, the sensation of being genuinely inhabited by one's own life. The third phase involves the real interior work, examining the beliefs that made the dynamic possible in the first place, the attachment wounds that made anxious love feel like the only kind available, the early relational templates that told her love and instability were naturally paired. This is where the work gets difficult and where it becomes most permanent. A woman who moves through this phase does not simply recover from a bad relationship, she re-architects her entire understanding of what she is available for. There is something that happens to a woman's sense of femininity through this process that deserves to be named. The version of herself she performs within a diminishing relationship is often a compressed and anxious version of her actual feminine nature. She has learned to manage her power down, to soften her intuition, to apologize for her needs, to present a version of herself that is non-threatening enough to keep the peace. Emerging from this, she begins to inhabit her femininity differently, not as performance and not as defense, as expression. She is no longer broadcasting from a place of lack or fear of abandonment. She is radiating from a place of genuine fullness, and this changes the quality of every relationship in her life. The professional ones, the friendships, the way she moves through a room. This is what Jung understood as the integration of the anima, not in its compensatory, projected form, but in its genuine expression within a woman's own psyche, as the voice of her deepest creativity and relational intelligence. The word that comes to mind is magnetic, but magnetic in the old sense of the word, not seductive in a performed way, but drawing toward itself what is genuinely aligned. The final thing worth naming is this: when a woman breaks a pattern that has been running for generations, she does not only change her own life, she changes what is possible for the women who are watching, a daughter, a younger sister, a friend who has been wondering if anyone else feels what she feels. This is not a dramatic or revolutionary act from the outside. From the outside, it often looks like nothing more than a woman who seems more settled, more herself, less available for dynamics that used to consume her, but the transmission is real. It moves through families like water through stone, slowly, invisibly, and permanently. Jung believed that the most powerful work a person can do is not performed on the public stage, but in the interior, in the room where no one is watching. In the decision made not for anyone else's understanding, but for the sake of one's own coherence. A woman who chooses herself in this way is not giving up on love, she is finally learning to recognize it,